Are you a new DM feeling maybe just a little bit overwhelmed by all of the rules? Or perhaps you've DM'd previous editions, but are new to 5th edition and want to know which rules you should start learning first? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you a prioritized list of the most important rules you should learn first. Hey, Luke Hart here. I have been a Dungeon Master since high school, and I create weekly D&D videos with information and resources to help Dungeon Masters run awesome games. Okay, here's the deal. Reading and memorizing and applying all of these rules can be intimidating as crap. So if you're new to DMing, or maybe just new to 5th edition, where do you even start? So what I'm going to do is give you a list of the top 10 rules you should focus on learning first from the 3 core rulebooks. And I'm going to put them roughly in order of what I consider to be the most important rules to the least important rules. Now, these will be broad categories of rules, so it will take some reading and whatnot. And I should probably mention that this is my take on the topic, based upon which rules I use the most and which ones come up the most often in my games. So if you have thoughts on what the most important rules are, please let us know. There's probably some stuff that I've forgotten about. Oh, and as always, remember to stay tuned to the very end of the video for a special DM bonus tip. Alright, now, before I jump into the list, I want to mention just one tiny thing. A Dungeon Master should learn and be familiar with most of the rules. I mean, I don't know, call me crazy, but it seems to me that if you're going to be running the game, you should probably have a decent idea of what the rules are. But of course, that's not to say that you need to have them all memorized. I mean, there are entire segments of the rules that almost never come up in the game, so they're probably not worth bothering over. However, a Dungeon Master should really learn enough to run a fun and satisfying game for his players. Now, I certainly don't believe that one person can know and memorize all of the rules, though I'm probably sure there are some rare specimens that can, and I am certainly not one of them. Furthermore, the more you run Dungeons & Dragons, the more ingrained the rules will become in your brain. So, I would definitely not let a lack of knowledge stop you from running the game. Just make sure that you are doing your best to get up to speed. A DM not having sufficient understanding of the rules is a big mistake for a whole host of reasons that go beyond the scope of this video to discuss. And sufficient is the key descriptor there. Don't go crazy, know just enough. Anyway, travel the path of not learning the rules at your own risk. Alright, let's jump into our list of rules, shall we? The very first thing that a Dungeon Master should focus on learning are the rules around ability scores and ability checks. These are Chapter 7 in the Player Handbook. And the reason this makes number 1 on our list is that ability checks come up all the time in the game. It doesn't matter if you're in an exploration scene, a social interaction, or a combat, you're going to be using ability checks. You know, things like persuasion and stealth and athletics checks. And as a corollary to that, check out using ability scores on page 237 of the Dungeon Master Guide. There it goes a little bit more in depth for the Dungeon Master and explains the advantage-disadvantage system in 5th edition. And advantage and disadvantage come up all the time during gameplay. Alright, number 2 is combat. Chapter 9 in the Player Handbook. I mean, come on folks, Dungeons & Dragons is basically a war game where instead of your players controlling armies, they're controlling characters. So yeah, you are more than likely going to be using the combat rules a whole lot. Now, I don't really want to get into a big debate about D&D being a storytelling game or a role-playing game, because I basically agree that it is. You are role-playing a character trained to a large extent in the combat arts. And through the course of gameplay, a story is told that almost always revolves around combat of some sort. And you know what, if there's any doubt, let's take a look at the Dungeons & Dragons character sheet, shall we? I mean, 90% of it contains stats and information that are really only used during combat. So yeah, learning the combat rules is going to be number 2 on our list. And I totally get that some groups rarely have combats in their games, but I consider those outliers. I feel like those are probably few and far between. Alright, number 3 is learning the equipment rules in Chapter 5 of the Player Handbook. And in particular, pay attention to the weapons and armor rules. The other items don't tend to come up quite so often during gameplay, and you can always look them up if needed. And number 4 on our list are the spellcasting rules, Chapter 10 in the Player Handbook. Dungeons & Dragons is a game that heavily features magic, unless of course you're planning on running a low magic campaign. But most of the time, the spellcasting rules come up quite a bit during gameplay, so best learn them. However, please note that this does not include learning what all of the spells do, because there are a lot of spells. I will actually address how I handle learning all of the spells in the bonus tip at the end of the video. Alright, and moving on folks, we have number 5, character creation rules. And this is actually chapters 1 through 4 in the Player Handbook, so that is a lot of stuff. Now, some people will tell you that it is the player's job to understand how their characters work, and I agree to a certain extent. However, the Dungeon Master does need to have a clue in this area. And why is that? Well, first of all, your players will often ask you for help with their characters. Now, this might be during character creation or just during gameplay, but they will look to you for guidance. And as another note, some players are better than others at remembering how things work, so they might need a little bit of reminding. And some players have a tendency to misremember how their abilities work, making them drastically more powerful than they actually are. Unless, of course, the Dungeon Master is there to gently correct them. And just in case you're wondering, I do have certain players who misremember their character's abilities with great, startling frequency. Oh, and as a quick tip, feel free to let your players use pre-generated characters, especially if they're new to 5th edition. I really think that creating characters is probably the most challenging and confusing part of the game for new players. Oh, and real quick, I want to give a shout out to Son of a Sofa Man. He's one of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks a lot, dude, for joining with me on this video creation journey. Alright, number 6 is the introduction to the Monster Manual, which starts on page 4 of the Monster Manual. Now, I am not talking about learning all of the monster entries in the Monster Manual, though you will have to learn the individual monsters that you use in your game. I'm really just talking about the introduction to the Monster Manual. In addition to containing things that we would expect there, things like monster sizes, types, and hit dice, it contains some very important rules that are not found elsewhere in the core rulebooks, even though you'd think that they should be. For instance, rules on blind sight and true sight and telepathy are squirreled away there. You know, it almost feels like Wizards of the Coast was trying to hide them from us. Well, Jeremy, Mike, is that true? Anyway, since I don't really expect an answer, number 7 is the Creating Adventure Rules. You will find them in Chapter 3 of the Dungeon Master Guide. In particular, I'd pay attention to the Creating Encounters section on page 81. If you create your own homebrew adventures, these rules are moderately important. But of course, if you run modules, you can pretty much skip these. And by the way, I used to be a guy who strictly ran homebrew adventures, but the more that I run modules, the more and more that I love it. Alright, number 7 is Treasure in Chapter 7 of the Dungeon Master Guide. Yeah, so we're playing D&D, right? I mean, what the heck is D&D if there isn't sweet, sweet loot involved? So yeah, it probably behooves you to take a look at the treasure rules. Just bear in mind that you're most likely to use them outside of gameplay when you're preparing for your game. So you will usually have plenty of time to reference them. Alright, number 9 is creating non-player characters in Chapter 4 of the Dungeon Master Guide. Now, NPCs are actually super important in Dungeons & Dragons. I just don't know how useful I find the rules in the 5th edition Dungeon Master Guide to be. I mean, yeah, sure, they help, but I don't need them to create an awesome, memorable NPC for my players. So just because I rank those rules low on the list does not mean that I don't think creating NPCs is important. And finally, number 10 is the Running the Games rules in Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master Guide. There is a lot of useful stuff in there that you will certainly want to check out. And you know, I think that an argument probably could have been made that this section should have been ranked higher on my list. However, I do feel that these rules are rather broad and lack depth to a certain extent. But definitely on the list and definitely worth reading and learning. By the way, if you're finding my videos helpful, please feel free to check out my Patreon page. Not only do my patrons get the opportunity to join me on my creative endeavors, but they also get lots of cool exclusive perks. Link down below. Alright, it is the DM bonus tip time. Let's talk about learning all of the spells because, yeah, that's a lot of stuff. Instead of reading through all of them in great detail or especially trying to memorize them, what I try to do is just memorize the main idea of what each spell in the multitude of spells does. And then even then, I'm not super successful at it. See, specifics can be looked up in gameplay when somebody actually casts the spell. But to get a basic understanding of what the spells do, I just tend to read over them every so often, maybe when I'm bored or when I'm indisposed. However, what I can tell you is that the most productive moments of learning how a spell works is when I'm preparing to run an enemy spellcaster. Because then I'm going to be reading those spells over very carefully as I decide which ones I'm going to be using in combat. Finally, the spells are really going to start sticking in your brain when your players start casting them in the game and you need to resolve their effects. I have found that looking up a spell at the table and then resolving it during gameplay is what has really helped things stick in my brain. If you want to learn more about dungeon mastering, I recommend you check out my Dungeon Mastering 101 playlist right here. As always, if you have any questions about dungeon mastering, please let me know. I'm always happy to help. Smash that thumbs up button if you found this video helpful. Click here to subscribe, and over here you can watch some more fine videos. And until next time, let's play D&D.
Let's play D&D.